Dreaming Big, Working Small, how 3 built environment academics facilitate design studios to capture dreams of Indigenous communities.
Belba, I'm Carol Gosam from the University of Queensland. I'm a Dirrabul Kumbulbara Obama person from Ravenstone, North Queensland. I teach in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Queensland, and also I'm the Director of Indigenous Engagement.
My name's Christine Phillips. I'm a non-Indigenous registered architect, academic and writer based in the Eastern Kulin Nation at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia, and co-leader of the RMIT Architecture and Urban Design Ullage Willam Lab.
And I'm Jock Gilbert. I'm a non-Indigenous registered landscape architect. I'm based here in Naarm in Melbourne in the Eastern Kulin Nation. I teach and manage a program, undergraduate program at RMIT University, and with Christine, I'm a co-leader of the RMIT Architecture and Urban Design Ullage Willam Design Research Lab.
We'll be exploring 3 dreams of 3 very different Indigenous elders and communities in our paper.
So the project that I'm going to talk about is a new Indigenous centre at the University of Queensland, and it's based on Yuggera lands. I live and work on Yuggera lands as well and acknowledge traditional owners.
The project I'll be working or talking about in this paper is one I'm partnering with Uncle Leonard Clark, a Kray-Warong elder, and his community in the Western District of Victoria on a project, a vision he has to address the over-incarceration of First Nations people in Australia.
And the project I'll be talking about partners with the Culperamilli Aboriginal Corporation on ILC ceded land in southwestern New South Wales. The corporation and the families associated with that are Barkindji people, and that land is Barkindji country, and it sits just inside the confluence of the Barker Darling and the Murray Millai. So we've located the 3 projects here on the AATSIS map of Aboriginal Australia. Carol is going to talk to 2 locations over here in the west and on the east coast. I will be speaking of 1 location here at the bottom of Barkindji country, and Christine will speak of her project here in Western Victoria.
And as you can see from this AATSIS map, Aboriginal Australia is culturally and linguistically diverse, with an ongoing culture existing for over 65,000 years. Australia as a nation is currently grappling with reconciling with its brutal colonial past, and this has had direct implication on architects and landscape architects, as well as architectural and landscape architectural education. There's been a rapid demand from both the public and commercial sectors within the built environment for architects and landscape architects to engage with Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous knowledge holders. This has led to an ever-increasing feature of design school programs in Australia to set project briefs grounded in real-world problem scenarios of Indigenous peoples. Mediated by the studio coordinator, students participate in project-based learning related to specific situational and contextual elements derived from the community setting. Little has been explored in how deep listening methods are employed within the context of design studio teaching in relation to visualizing, valuing, and informing the aspirational dreams of Indigenous communities. Employing critical reflective methods, our paper will explore relational approaches to project-based problem learning, which employ deep listening methods to meet, capture, and elaborate 3 dreams of Indigenous communities, senior elders, and knowledge holders, explored within 3 Indigenous-led design studios by us as 3 built environment academics. Many Indigenous communities express aspirational dreams as part of their story. These are often big and ambitious and have remained unrealized due to a lack of resource, land title and tenure, and the ability to navigate regulatory and government barriers. Our paper will focus not on how deep listening techniques are taught to students, but rather how us as the authors, as design studio leaders, engage in deep listening methods that are particular to each studio context. We contend the design studio itself becomes insinuated in the story of the community through the dream, responding to, valuing, visualizing, and informing the dreams of the community. Through an ongoing iterative process, we argue that the design studio becomes part of the ongoing transformation of the dreams.
Yes, so deep listening is essentially a Western term and interpretation of Dadiri, which is Miriam Rose Angamir Bowman's concept, which was defined as an Indigenous education philosophical practice. Other Indigenous researchers have elaborated on this and contextualized it for education and higher learning. Deep listening in the context of architecture is a creative research methodology, and it's been described as something that sits between Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledge systems, where degrees of listening are deemed important. Essentially, it aims a process of listening that is less superficial, with a degree of responsiveness to counter colonial legacies that have been operating within the architectural space. It presents practices for challenge. It presents challenges for practices in terms of architectural engagement, with the architect listening to Indigenous clients and stakeholders, the architect responding and interpreting what is heard, but often filtered through the architect's own social, political, and cultural lens. So this process can be fraught with cultural, political, and economic hegemonies. So architects and researchers and also academics, we attempt to sort of be less transactional and shallow in listening in the context of working with Indigenous peoples in studio settings. We don't want to limit it to a single encounter. We attempt to prioritise project objectives and not to move quickly through ideas and cultural knowledge and selectively discard and aspects of that. So a key aspect of deep listening then is building relationality with First Nations people, which is highly valued. And Indigenous people often say that transactional activities are less valued and highly offensive and counter to listening deeply about Indigenous aspirations. So building relationality over a period of time involves numerous activities and points of contact to give substance to the dream. And
for Christine and I, as non-Indigenous practitioners and researchers, this is a critical point, and much of the richness of understandings of deep listening that Carol's just described gets lost in translation, and we do our best to kind of understand that. The ability from a non-Indigenous perspective to undertake deep listening is underpinned by what's been described as by Ngawi Professor Carolyn Briggs here at RMIT University as the cultivation of the ability to zip it, to override one's impulse to contribute before one has actually listened. It's very important. We draw on work of Janet McGaw and Onoma Pieris, who in turn have drawn on the work of Marcia Langton, and particularly to her PhD in the reference to storying, where they say at the heart of deep listening lies a commitment to respecting Indigenous knowledge systems as different and yet equal. Where Western academic discourse often favours text, Indigenous knowledge, of course, has traditionally been communicated through performative practices, including story, dance and song, but also cups of tea, meals, time spent around the fire, time spent doing other things. So deep listening begins with sharing of stories and the offering of an opportunity for each party to situate themselves in the story of the other. It's a process, of course, as Carol said, that takes time and requires great patience. So we're now going to proceed to introduce you more fully to the three projects that we're discussing, and we'll talk about those in terms of the dream itself underpinning each project, the building of relationality, and then, as Carol suggested, the way that the response is offered in relation to that deep listening.
Yeah, so relationality on my project was really built prior to even the starting with a brief or coming up with the idea of a studio. So as a First Nations person, I've had lots of experience, obviously, for being immersed in family and community relationality, but in the context of a university, it requires a different set of relationality and building with people who are not your kin. So the newly appointed Pro Vice Chancellor Indigenous Engagement in 2018 is not my line manager and has no authority over my work as an academic in the Architecture, Design and Planning school. But relationality is important for all Indigenous people who work on campus. So we first met in 2018 and we both attended a book launch, which was the Handbook of Indigenous Architecture, where Professor Fredericks shared her dream to have a building or Indigenous centre like those illustrated in the book. And this dream has been an aspiration for a whole range of UQ Indigenous staff for several decades, but it's remained largely undefined and by the university or by those who actually even talk about the dream. So relationality, as I mentioned, occurred prior to the project, but also during the studio project. So I invited the Pro Vice Chancellor on an architectural tour of Perth, Western Australia, on the western coast of Australia. These buildings, some of the buildings that are illustrated in this slide were chosen by myself, but we visited many more. We also looked at a mixture of public urban spaces that had Indigenous themes in it, but also higher education facilities, Indigenous centres that were built between the period of 2005 and 2019. We also met with senior Indigenous academics, researchers, and looked at their research centres and how they operated, how they integrated with landscape or not across multiple campuses. So some of the self-guided tour that we conducted was Kurungul Karajan and Newlark, which are two separate buildings at Edith Cowan University on different campuses, and also the Curtin University Midland campus building, which is in Perth as well, and Yagan Square, which was an urban centre. So to the next slide. So about the new Indigenous Centre dream and how it occurs at UQ, I think it's best articulated through what the Pro Vice Chancellor said quite simply and repeatedly. No Indigenous visitor on the St Lucia campus can see us. We're invisible. So the brief really attempted to bring together a whole range of Indigenous facilities that operate across multiple campuses at UQ. One is the Indigenous Health Poach Centre, Research Centre, the UQ Anthropology Museum, which has a significant Indigenous collection from Queensland, Indigenous Student Support Services, accommodation for Indigenous academic and professional staff into one single location. So the next slide is the response. So the response obviously is the development of the studio program. The studio program was called Interrogating Difference, Indigeneity and UQ Campus Landscape. It really sought to study and understand the landscape as a social and political terrain, which students could then sort of respond to sites chosen. We attempted to really capture in the brief a strong desire for visibility and campus presence for the newly imagined Indigenous Centre. I developed the brief and had a discussion with the Pro Vice Chancellor on preferred campus sites across UQ's assets, but St Lucia was chosen as the key site. There were 3 sites that were nominated, and one site in particular was nominated by the Pro Vice Chancellor as having significant positive responses from staff and students who really strongly associated with this space, and that was the UQ Campus Lakes. As a part of the program, I formed an Indigenous panel of senior academics from the University of Queensland and the Queensland University of Technology, so that students could understand dreams and different manifestations of dreams in other campuses and other institutions. Also, how they accommodated things like student services as subcomponents of larger building programs, and what would it mean for the project at UQ. The traditional studio program really incorporated things like lectures, industry practitioners, and students conceptualizing essentially schematic designs. The Pro Vice Chancellor attended reviews for half a day because her heavy work schedule didn't permit her for the entire day of the studio reviews. So following the studio, as illustrated on the slide, there was another project which really captured and picked up on this ongoing sort of vision for a new centre at UQ. It was a separate project. It was actually funded by the university and led by myself and 2 other colleagues. It was preceded by a 6-month engagement process with staff and students on 3 campuses. We sought to undertake campus walks with 52 staff and students and elicit their likes and dislikes about the campus, and the desire for a new campus facility that clearly identified itself as being sort of associated with Indigenous staff and students was iterated through this process. The dream was mentioned multiple times, and essentially it remains alive and unfulfilled for a lot of Indigenous staff and students on the campus because it doesn't have a dedicated budget, and due to complex funding models, even though the university did attempt to explore what the building could be, but wanted to really relocate a small portion of the Indigenous services on campus into an existing building. There are limitations and constraints essentially with the studio program. The dream becomes incorporated into a hyper reality of the design studio, and it creates a tension between student learning outcomes and aspirations of the dream.
The relationality for me began from an invitation we received from Uncle Lenny Clark that you see here, inviting RMIT's Architecture and Urban Design School to partner with him on a project he would like to build on his family's Aboriginal owned land in the Western District. So there was no brief. It was Jock and myself hopping on a train, 4-hour train trip to meet Uncle Lenny. And we spent a day with Uncle Lenny, meeting his community, walking around country, understanding the needs and aspirations of his community. And we then co-developed a brief and have run multiple design studios since 2019 with our RMIT architecture students, and co-led by myself and my colleague Stasinos Mansis. So the deep listening has evolved over those years, and through the work that the students have produced has also meant that the Uncle Lenny's dream has also evolved through the visualizations, through the experimentations, and through the ongoing development of the brief with Uncle Lenny. The response has been not just the output in which the students have produced from semester to semester, which has enabled Uncle Lenny to visualize and rethink his dream and develop it, but also to support the community in establishing a not-for-profit charity organization engaging and inviting Uncle Lenny to participate in public forums, supporting the community to apply for government grants, and preparing philanthropic documents to attract funding from philanthropy.
Thanks, Christine. And the nature of the dream that the Culpamilly Aboriginal Corporation held and holds dear, and into which I was invited, is the notion that they're really looking to sustain the land on the property for future generations through enterprise development fostered by the establishment of appropriate infrastructure, which is where the work that we're doing comes in. The aim of the corporation is to ensure economic independence through this enterprise development with utter respect for the cultural and environmental values that exist on the property, Culper Station. So relationships were fostered very much through design studios, and studios were structured in order to be able to spend time with students on country and to ensure that reciprocity was ensured, that all work was then returned back, both through review panels and through documentation packages. It was also underpinned by non-design studio and non-accessible field trips, where students have been able to take up the opportunity to engage in their own relationship with that community. Excuse me. And that further opportunities to give value to the voice of the community have always been followed up through co-authoring and co-contributions to major events like Melbourne Design Week and Open House Melbourne. So the response, and these are also related to relationality because the responses also help to build that relationship. We have co-produced a series of community-led events. We've of course provided a series of reports and recommendations that have helped to engage the community with other funding and government organisations. And that's been underpinned by our developing understanding of each other's positions through co-authoring and co-production.
So in terms of our forthcoming Dreaming Big, Working Small paper, this is a brief outline of some of the content that we'll consider and questions that we'll answer. How does current literature define deep listening as a creative research method? What are the author's understanding of deep listening within the context of 3 Indigenous-led built environment design studios? And how do these understandings manifest in each studio? How did the authors employ deep listening methods to meet, capture, and elaborate 3 dreams of Indigenous communities? And how were each of the deep listening methods of the authors embedded and integral to the design studio pedagogy? How do these methods generate different outcomes, responses in relation to each of the dreams? What constitutes an outcome and response in relation to these dreams? And the limitations, tensions, and constraints of the design studio to fully articulate and realise Indigenous aspirations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.